So if you are looking for the webinar, What's Good Seed? Congratulations, you're in the right place. This is day 2, session 1 of our Good Seeds mini conference, and I'm really glad that you're all here. Those of you who were on the line yesterday will know that this event is hosted by the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security in Atlantic Canada. My name is Steph Hughes, and I'm the Regional Program Manager for that program in the 4 Atlantic provinces. If we haven't met yet, I'd very much like to remedy that. So I've put my contact information as well as various websites up on your screen. Feel free to jot that information down or screenshot it. I'd love to know about your interest in seeds, what you're doing with seeds on your farm and in your garden. And I'd love to answer questions and tell you about the program that we're running here in the Atlantic provinces. If you're from outside the Atlantic region, that's great. You just go to seedsecurity.ca/team and you'll find our whole national team, including the person who coordinates the program in your region. I'm going to start today with a brief land acknowledgement. And those of you who joined us yesterday will know that we're taking a participatory approach to our land acknowledgements. So I'm going to share where I'm calling in from, and I would invite you to use the chat function on your Zoom app to share where you're calling in from. And if you know your community by its Indigenous name or its treaty name, please share that with us as well. If you don't know the Indigenous history of the land that you're on, this map that's on your screen now, I found at www.whos.land. And it's a really great resource to start to find out a little bit about that. So I'm joining our call from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is situated in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The Mi'kmaq are the founding people of Nova Scotia, and when the Europeans came, including my ancestors, came to this land in the 16th and 17th centuries, Mi'kma'ki was a huge stretch of territory encompassing parts of the Gaspé Peninsula, most of modern-day New Brunswick, all of Nova Scotia, all of PEI. As well as parts of Newfoundland, and in fact it still is. Most of Mi'kma'ki is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and British people signed initially in 1725. And those treaties never dealt with the surrender of land or resources from Indigenous people. Instead, they recognized the title that the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet people had, and they set out parameters for what was always supposed to be a nation-to-nation relationship. So it's important, I think, to think about that at the beginning of events and always, and especially as a people who are particularly concerned with good food and good seed. I think it's important to think about Indigenous land as the sites where good food and good seed are grown, and to also reflect on for whom and by whom that good food and good seed are grown, who has access to it and why, and how did that happen. So with that in mind, I wanted to point you all to a podcast that I discovered this year, which has been really, it's an amazing podcast and an amazing resource for starting to think a little bit more about Indigenous ecosystems, traditional knowledge, Indigenous foodways. It's called the Native Seed Pod, and it's produced by the Cultural Conservancy in the US. And it explores and celebrates native foodways, ancestral seeds, and traditional ecological knowledge. They have 2 seasons so far, and every episode is an incredible conversation. So if you're looking to deepen your perspective on food and seed, that's a really nice way to do it. Today, we're going to be deepening our perspectives on food and seed with a question that is very near and dear to my heart. What's good seed? I started with the Bauta Family Initiative in 2013, and we had a tagline then, and we in fact still have this tagline that says, good food comes from good seed. It has a really nice ring to it. And this was kind of our way of asking people who care about good food, because there are so many people who care about good food in the world, food that's sustainably produced, organic, nutritious, delicious, seasonal, sustainable, all of those things, to ask those people to also care about good seed. But what is good seed? So many of you were asked this question as part of registering for the webinar. I think I asked you to name something like 5 words that describe what good seed is to you. For those of you who did answer that question, this is what you said. So the idea with kind of a word cloud like this is that the bigger the word, the more often it was indicated. Really what this slide does is it shows us that there's a huge diversity of values and priorities and principles that come up for us when we think about, you know, the phrase good seed. It's not a simple thing. So this morning and this afternoon, we'll be exploring good seeds from the perspective of growing seed on the farm, stewarding it, selecting it, and ensuring its quality. We have, I think, 3 hours of content planned over the course of the day, and we're not even going to get to all of these wonderful words, but we are going to get to a lot of them. We've got a lot of goodies that we're going to cover, so I'm really excited to get started. So thanks to you. You all have kind of helped us frame our discussion for today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 speakers, each of whom is bringing a wealth of experience and wisdom to this conversation. I circulated their complete bios in an email to each of you about an hour ago, so I'm not going to read those now, but I do want to very warmly welcome Petra Page-Mann of Fruition Seeds in New York State, Jodi Lew-Smith from Sweetgrass Farm in Vermont, Marie-Claude Comeau of Radicule in Quebec, and Heron Breen from Fedco Seeds and Fruits of Our Labor Farm in Maine. Thank you guys very much for being here. I'm excited to hear from you. Petra, I'm gonna turn things over to you.
Why, thank you, Steph. It is such a joy to see you and to see you all. What a beautiful screen of people that I love and that I know and that I don't know. So I look so forward to getting to know you if I don't already, and just thank you so much for spending this moment with us all this morning. And I'd love to begin our time together. What is good seed and what is good regionally adapted seed? I've been paying a lot of attention to the oaks in our valley. And if you haven't been to the Finger Lakes yet of upstate New York, this is your cordial invitation. Post-pandemic, I look so forward to welcoming you to our farm and into our home. And you'll see there's lots of hills and there's lots of valleys and lots of lakes. And so there's lots of microclimates. And there might be, technically the same genus species, red oak, white oak, in the valleys, up on the hillsides, on rocky cliffs falling into ravines on top. And so there's lots of they're the same genus species, but there's so much uniqueness, whether it's the acorn shape or even honestly the bark and the subtleties and all of the leaves. It's amazing how much a white oak can vary from even a half mile away and 1,000 feet of different elevation. And so I've been thinking a lot about how that regional adaptation is reflected in our ecology around us and how we can begin to reflect that in our communities as well, whether it's the seeds that we grow on Point Pelee or the seeds in PEI. And I just love so much that we are all sharing this conversation on what is good seed and regionally adapted seed. And I think too, good seeds are like good questions. They aren't an end unto themselves. They're just a beginning of something new that we can begin to imagine, but we can't even fathom what is yet to come. And so I'm so grateful to be a part of this little seed of this mini conference exploring these subjects. And I'm especially grateful, staff, and for so many facets of our communities that are really leaning into not just the performative, okay, here's the land acknowledgement, but what does an analysis of colonialism really bring to our work? And especially when it comes to seeds and regionally adapted seeds, because it's so easy to think that we are creating systems that are different, even though we might be perpetuating a lot of the same systems. And so something that, and I am, as I share this, at the top of my own list of people to and organizations to decolonize. I have a seed company. See, just in that sentence, I have a seed company. I co-founded a seed company in 2012 called Fruition Seeds. And we work closely with Cornell, our land grant university here in New York, and just learning about the land grant university system and how, if you don't have this analysis of what colonialism looks like and does and continues then you would think that that is regional adaptation at its heart. I mean, in the United States, every state has their land grant university, which is, among other reasons, were founded to be growing seed and distributing seed to their local bioregions, which is just amazing. and so, of course, they've evolved. They've iterated a lot across the years, but without a lens of colonialism, suddenly, we're not talking about how they were also just on stolen land and stolen seeds, continuing to exploit resources, life sources, in exactly the same ways, in so many of the same ways that our ancestors and community members down south and all across this globe at different points in time have enslaved ourselves and each other and our seeds in different ways. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this community and conversation of really beginning to go deeper into looking at construct and how these patterns repeat. And what is scale? If we're talking about scale, is that just evidence of colonial patterns perpetuating? So moving forward a little bit, I love, love, love this poem. It's a poem written by our dear friend Maddie Halpert, which perhaps some of you know, and if you don't already, you will one day. And she loves seeds, she loves growing them, she loves plant breeding as well, and lots of other ways to say all of these things. And it reminds me of, as a preface to the Michael Pollan quote from The Botany of Desire, agriculture is the brilliant plan of the grasses to get back at the trees. Which I'll say that one more time. Agriculture is the brilliant plan of the grasses to get back at the trees. So I know for myself, I take great pride in the agency that I have to control things in my life. And so this is a wonderful poem from Maddie called Playing Family. Oh, how many ways have I declared, okay, I'll be the mother. You are my children. I have told this to beloved plants in plain English. I have sung it in soft songs and whispered it into watering cans. I've proclaimed it by pulling out pollination kits and seed sieves, and I've announced this motherhood with disproportionate conviction, like a kid teetering through fields on oversized high heels, which dangle tentatively from flexed feet with every step, and yet she is convinced the world believes her. Meanwhile, wind rustling, the plants shake their leaves with loving laughter, as if to say, oh, how precious, how adorable is our little sister. So I look so forward to you all meeting Maddie one day. And one of the things that I love about Maddie's poem, and I love to Malcolm Gladwell and his wonderful book, David and Goliath. If you haven't already read or listened to his brilliant 17-minute TED Talk on David and Goliath, it is breathtaking and so essential to the work of anyone interested in being the change and seeding the change. And one of the main things that I learned from that book is that advantages are not always advantages, and disadvantages are not always disadvantages. And when it comes to regional seed and good seed, I continue to restate this mantra over and over to myself. And it feels like every 6 months I have a deeper understanding of what advantages are in fact advantages and why and how, and what disadvantages are. How it's all just so much more intertwined than I ever would have imagined. And so certainly, I spent many years on the West Coast growing seed, which is one of the heart centers of this planet and arid climates for whom global commodity seed production industrially is celebrated and looked to. And so returning to the Northeast, I was so passionate about, what are these crops that we can actually do well here. And I've been surprised across the years for that conviction wavers. And sometimes I'm like, it's totally not worth doing spinach. And then a heron reminded me that there are islands off the coast of Maine for whom they have the perfect conditions to grow really high quality spinach. And so I just would love to, before we dive into just a general, like, what are reliable crops to regionally adapt with ease, relative ease in the Northeast, and what are those outliers? I just would love to give us all permission to think outside the box that we have been offered and that we offer ourselves. Because one of the, I forget who said this, like the loveliest trick of the devil is to convince you that he doesn't exist. And the loveliest trick of thinking that we have arrived is that we'll never arrive. And so good seeds, good questions are just this beautiful invitation to keep asking questions and to keep growing and sowing and saving seeds and learning from them, not assuming that we are the ones controlling the process. And not having the set goal and the solution mindset that makes us think that we are in control. So yes, these reliable seeds, and pardon me, I have this wonderful dog in my lap, but perhaps I'll usher Javi to the floor because it's time to lift up one of my favorite squash of all time, which shout out to Patrice Fortier, speaking of wonderful provinces. And I met Sibley Squash on his farm at the end of June. I think it was 2015. And so this is such a phenomenal short season and also incredibly long storage and super sweet squash, but which is all to say that wet seeded crops are phenomenally easy to adapt brilliantly in our short seasons and our humid seasons here in the Northeast and Atlantic Canada. And so some are, of course, easier than others. The cucurbits are much easier in some ways than like the solonids that need more heat, but just yes, I grew up 10 miles that way. And I thought that we couldn't grow peanuts, that we couldn't grow watermelons if we got 5 red ripe peppers on a plant in my father's garden. I thought that it was a very productive plant. And now if there's less than 25 on a plant, we're like, nope, you don't get to save, we don't get to save your seed. And so what are these? It's amazing how generous and adaptive these seeds are. And we might need to cast the wide net to find those seeds to begin with. But yes, don't let anyone stop you, and certainly me. So wet seeded crops are much easier than, dry seeded crops, whether they're flowers, whether they're herbs. Things like lettuce I found is easier than most dry seeded crops to grow, even outside a tunnel, in a garden, in a field. Brassicas are also really easy to grow. Some of them are more challenging for other reasons, but as a whole, even though they're a dry seed, that pod has a wide window of harvestability. So brassicas are by and large easy, although certainly if anyone has any cauliflower broccoli tips, let's talk. Or maybe I should move to that island in Maine already. And beans, peas, also easy to grow. And again, like at large scale, can we compete with commodity crops? No, but do we need to compete with these commodity crops? No. And this is where good seeds are good relationships with plants, good relationships with people, centering human relationships over profit, which it's so fraught. All of these contracts that we create between seed companies and seed growers, and they're just so fraught with prioritizing life as a commodity over life as a burgeoning relationship of becoming and adaptation, co-adaptation. So corn also super reasonable to grow, as well as many flowers, including sunflowers, although many flowers are not. And so here are some of those outliers, whether it's spinach, beets, quinoa, onions, anything in that allium family, carrots, totally possible, and especially at a small scale, even at a pretty high level. But, you know, if we're trying to really honestly compete in a modern marketplace, it's a different conversation, which just means like, oh yeah, these are not covered. These are, the more we can encourage ourselves to value those social values, whether they're social like between humans or social between plants, like really relating to ourselves and all the beings around us as family, as ourselves, will really change the conversation. So I'm delighted to hear Marie-Claude and Heron and Jodi and so many other people in this time together with this mini conference, dive into some more of these stories of those human by human and also human with plants, all of these relationships and possibilities. And what I love about these people is that they're not focused on solutions, they're focused on humans and on plants. And yes, I just so appreciate this question of good seed and what is good seed, and digging a little deeper into that socioeconomic, geo-biopolitical equation that is this living, breathing conversation of where we find ourselves and these seeds that we are sowing together right now.
Thank you so much, Petra. That was such a beautiful sharing. And I love that your dog was with you the whole time. That gave me a lot of calmness and cuteness to start the webinar off with. Makes me want to go upstairs and grab my cat.
Here to help, here to help. When you have the good dogs conference, let me know.
Yeah, you're top of the invite list for sure. Okay, I'm gonna reiterate an invitation to pop questions into the chat box. So thanks again so much, Petra. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to circle back during the kind of Q&A at the end to touch on some of those themes. It was a good way to open the webinar. Heron, I'm gonna turn it over to you now to talk a little bit about some of your work with Regional Seed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Petra. And we hope that we'll have Maddie as part of a open mic at a event in January called the Northeast Organic Seed Conference. And hopefully Maddie will be sharing with us even more poetry then. So look forward to that, folks. Good morning. Today I'm going to speak a little bit about like an example of some of the craziness that we all do with people and plants and all the stories that connect us, and Marie-Claude is going to also join me in this presentation. So I work for Fedco Seeds as my day job, and then I'm lucky enough to also have developed a laboratory of sorts. I call it a farm. It's been a lot of fun for the last 15 or 16 years, and I primarily do, it's evolved to basically be almost entirely seed work. Next slide. So thank you, Steph, for helping me with the slides today. I had some connectivity issues yesterday, so we're just trying to prevent that. So the story begins with a fruit. This is the small fruit of a Canadian crookneck squash. Next slide. This wonderful fruit, wonderful squash, is an indigenous variety centered in the greater Northeast for, who knows, maybe somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years of adaptation. but at least going back probably 500 years and probably quite a bit longer. And how this variety made its way from, quote, centers of diversity, centers of origin, likely in sort of the Central American and upper kind of parts of South America over the course of a couple thousand years or more, who knows? But it is extremely adapted. The flavor of this variety is like raw, is like eating a carrot. Very sweet, drenched in squash, very creamy and dry, and the deep orange flesh. And that neck is a wonderful, wonderful thing. These range somewhere, but usually between about 2 and 4 pounds. And that small bell has a very small seed cavity. So this is a variety that was grown by our tribal communities throughout the region, and then was adopted by the colonialists also because of its amazing flavor and keeping ability. Next slide. So here's a little timeline that was on a display a couple of years ago. And basically we have, this is the standard story for how that variety, crookneck, Canadian crookneck, became butternut. Because all of the flavor and keeping quality of what we call butternut today was bred with Canadian crookneck as its foundation. So the standard story is that somebody, and it's been established as Ellen Meter from the 1950s, crossed Canadian crookneck with this necklace machata. So this thing in the middle, I was able to actually track down the original breeding line that was in theory used to do that work, and basically created a squash that had this thick neck rather than the curved neck. Now the problem with the curved neck is that it often breaks in shipment. But so we're like, oh, there was butternuts before there was Waltham? Yes, very many. There was Rhode Island butternut. There was something called Eastern butternut. There was New Hampshire butternut. There was a number of different butternuts between the 1950s and 1968, when Robert E. Young released Waltham that we know by. So next slide. But it turns out that like all stories, it's not all in the hands of plant breeders working in experiment stations, and there's variations on this tale. The tale that has come to light over the last, say, dozen years or so by Dorothy Leggett is that her husband, late husband, and her in the late 1930s, they started experimenting, Charles Leggett started experimenting breeding squash. And he was claiming to be crossing crookneck, Canadian crookneck or gooseneck, with Hubbard. And this seems like an odd thing. These are different species. But so let's go back a little bit and realize that the word hybrid in pre-1930 meant a cross between two species. So there was a lot of breeding going on between various species of, say, flowers or vegetables and trees. This is part of the way we get hardiness in things like cherries and plums and pears. But the legend of Luther Burbank had spread this concept of interspecial crossing as what they would call, today we might call these wide crosses, but at the time these were called hybrids. So probably inspired by this concept, Charles Leggett was doing this work, and he got something that he called the butternut, smooth as butter and sweet as a nut, apparently was what he was claiming. And though he brings this result to the Waltham Experiment Station. So the Waltham Experiment Station is also the place where eventually in 1968, Waltham butternut is released from as like a new variety. Now, the Waltham Experiment Station folks have acknowledged that there was an interaction, but there's not clarity about whether this work that Leggett brought to them was an inspiration. Apparently, they were quite doubtful that he had succeeded in this thing with these two parents. And I also, when I heard this story, thought this was far-fetched. Was he the first person to try this? Was he among a number of workers, as we might call workers of breeding. Was his breeding project the basis of other regional work? These other butternuts that I spoke of in the other slide, whether it's from New Hampshire or otherwise, including the Waltham. Well, I now have discovered some things that may called correlate, not causate, or let's call it black extrapolation molasses. My favorite thing to eat every morning is extrapolate. I have discovered this little picture here in my own breeding work, very common now, some crosses between Machada and Maxima. This little beautiful orange pear-shaped thing is a red curry crossed with a butternut. And very delicious and random. In some cases, I didn't intend. In other cases, it's been an inspiration. In other cases, it's been a heck of a challenge to make it happen. But super productivity can be one result of interspecial crosses. And I've also observed a distinct lack of pollen donor flowers, what we would usually call male flowers in interspecial cross results. So that means that often the offspring, for some reason, have very few flowers, quote, pollen donor flowers. And oddly, the best maintained strain of Waltham that I know has very few pollen donor flowers. And in fact, when I've been doing breeding work or maintenance work with this strain, some of the plants have no male flowers at all, which has made selfing or sibbing, which is a type of breeding stabilization, very difficult. Next slide. This is an example of an interspecial cross that I've been working with. This is my dad holding one arm of a plant. There are 5 mature squash hanging off of this one arm of this plant. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down to the bottom. But it's been heck to stabilize because there's almost no male flowers on this entire row. And so has made any like breeding work kind of have had to reinvent the wheel. Next slide. But here is a 1947 seed catalog from the Robeson Seed Catalog, New York, which we've used as some examples yesterday. And they are offering butternut. Wait, this is before the 1950s versions and before the Rhode Island version and before the Waltham version, but they're offering butternut, and it says a recent introduction, which has become very popular. Where is all this? Where did all this come from? Next slide. And then we see the 1963 catalog. This is a little harder to read because I'm not a professional at making these things. But we also find butternut again in 1963, after a few strains of butternut have been released from universities, but preceding the release of Waltham. Probably Waltham is in breeding stages at this point. What I would like you to note is the little sentence that says, our butternut is an extremely uniform strain. Just so you know, companies do not advertise that their strain is extremely uniform if there's not a widespread understanding that there's a problem with the strain being maintained in the seed trade, meaning this is a reassurance to the buyer that ours is not bad. And so we like to use this little signaling language to let folks know. So we're already seeing that butternut is an unstable variety or concept, and that folks were trying to breed new ones and breed like the reason why experiment stations were working with this, and the reason why Waltham was introduced is because it was very stable. And so people have been trying to stabilize butternut, lots of different traits involved with that, and we continue to work on that today. Next slide. So this is what instability, quote, looks like. These are things that are supposed to be a thing. We give names to things. We ask them to conform. We ask them to wear uniform. We like the word uniform in our militaristic societies. So this is, everybody is supposed to be the same. Varieties have descriptions. This is supposed to be one variety. It has obviously been crossed up. How does this happen? Well, the very same issue with the male flowers is part of it. One plant that has lots of male flowers basically provides more pollen than a plant that has less male flowers. So even within a, quote, variety, dissonance or deviation, however we want to call these evil words we put on things that are, quote, non-uniform, often occurs because of a term called pollen compression. This is a term that was used years and years and years and years ago, has come out of favor. But basically this is that those that are donating the most pollen win, and those that have the fewer male flowers lose. So in a population that has few male flowers or no male flowers on certain plants, the plants that do have male flowers get to basically nudge the generation forward. Next slide. This is the strain maintained by Bloomingfields Farm in Gaylordsville, Connecticut. These are retired folks who have retired from farming. This is Diana and Melvin Bristol, who since the very early 80s maintained and selected a strain of Waltham on their farm in Zone 4B in Connecticut. So this is a really amazing strain that they both selected in the field, but also brought all the squash in and would go through them and eat every single one of them and grade them and look at them for keeping. And they have a strain that keeps, literally, I have squash from last year still now today, and they are perfectly fine for eating into May. So they have now retired and have been very kind to share their strain and unique selections from that, basically different selections that they flagged per plant, per squash, flagging the traits and the descriptions forward. And they've been doing this for so long that they have quite a catalog of amazing seed. Next slide. So this is that strain, which is just incredibly productive, incredibly vigorous, incredibly just a great squash. And I will tell you that I've looked at many, many different strains of Waltham, and they are mostly have gone south on us. The stabilization project that Robert E. Young used to develop Waltham, what happens, as Petra said, is stock seed, as Jodi will get into, is being used or not used, I should say, probably not being used in many different selections. And now Waltham is being grown, or something called Waltham is being grown in Western states and other places in the world. And the selection trait or the selection has not happened at all to keep its adaptability, to keep its productivity in our environment, and to keep its keeping ability. So this has become, with permission from Melvin and Diana, a seed selection project that a nonprofit is doing. And we've been using this as an example to find the next generation of stewards for this strain and to basically bring this strain out more widely. We also are looking at using this as a baseline to bring some downy mildew resistance and powdery mildew resistance in to this excellent strain. So we don't want to water anything down, but it's always great when you've got something good to keep it thinking forward. So we've got about 30 people involved in this project all across New England, and we're looking for farmers to be involved. And I have shared some of this seed with folks in Canada, and I'm happy to continue to share. Next slide. Here's what vigor looks like, my friends. This is a root from one of these plants. That is a full-size secateur pair of clippers, and you will note how many vines, how many primary arms are coming off of this huge thing. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you could probably count a 6th in there. And every one of those vines has at least 2 fruits and often 3 and sometimes 4. So if you're imagining to yourself how many fruits one of these plants is producing, you're looking at somewhere between 10 and 15 fruits per plant in an ideal season. And even in a bad season like we just had that was incredibly dry, we had so many fruits, I didn't know what to do with them, basically. So you can see the thickness of the root that is coming off of this plant is as thick as your finger, and there are many, many, many roots. So this is what vigor, and this is what adaptation means in terms of nutrient ability, water absorption, dealing with heat and cool stress. Pretty amazing. We should always be looking at this root structure as an example of vigor. Next slide. So, but let's return back to the original crookneck. There's no good reason why this seed is not available to all Indigenous communities at the very minimum, and many have started to re-maintain and reintroduce this into their foodways. About 15 years ago, I was lucky enough to receive a stock seed from Doug Egeland of New York, who's now retired as a seed saver, and he's really responsible for bringing back many and maintaining many rare varieties. I've seed saved it in Maine since then, and Doug actually was the person that brought this out of the USDA germplasm repository. So he was basically the person that decided this was needed to come out of cold storage and back into the warm hands of people and of the warm earth. Recently, I partnered with Marie-Claude on Quebec to do a contract production, and the resulting seed will be divided up. Some of this seed, this is how these things work, all these collaborations is, I figured that, you know, many folks that I knew were already working on this and didn't need a more original seed. But I spoke to my friend Ken Green down at Seed Shed, which is a sort of a non-Indigenous and Indigenous alliance. And it turns out that their food and seed crop got crossed up of this, and they were searching for an original strain. And so somehow it just happened to be that Marie-Claude was growing such a strain. And we're going to send some of this to our good friend Steve McComber as well, who is also a friend of Doug Egeland. Doug actually was kind of a mentor of Steve's and shared a number of things back in the day with him. And we're going to keep some backup seed for future productions. So if I have time, if we still have time, Steph, I'd love to turn this over to Marie-Claude to have her share her experience growing the Canadian crookneck.
Yes, sure thing. We're definitely going to make sure that we have time for that.
Yeah, I'm so happy that the seeds I grew this year will be shared across borders, and yeah, it's a relief in a way, because it's so disappointing, you know, when a cross happens like that.
Great. Can you see your slides up there now, Marie-Claude?
Can I see my slides? Yes, I can.
Okay.
So,
yay.
So these are just pictures of the squash germinating in the field that it will get planted in, and the squash growing. I think in the picture it's actually cucumbers, but we can just pretend it's squash. So yeah, it resulted in about 1 kilo of seeds. You can turn to the next slide, Steph.
There you go.
So that's the resulting seed. It's the extraction process, the washing and cleaning process. Yeah, so it resulted in about 1 kilo, and as Heron mentioned, it will get shared across borders to their original Iroquois tribes. And on this side, it will be distributed to the Kanawake Mohawk tribe. So growing the squash really made me realize the importance of Indigenous seed and the stories they carry, and of course, the responsibilities we have when we steward them. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to share with you a conversation I had with Heron this summer over email. So this Canada crookneck seed was grown on rented land. And my landowner this summer approached me, and he was really excited to grow corn and beans right beside my squash patch. And of course, you know, squash, beans, and corn are the three sisters, right? Oh, Steph, I think you can turn to the next slide.
Oh, yep, sure thing.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that the image on the left is the Iroquois nation's Haudenosaunee, and my farm is located right where this green arrow is pointing. So it's not a part of the Iroquois territory; it's part of the Abenaki nation territory, but they're neighbors, so it's still regional. So yeah, my landlord, who approached me about this Three Sister project, he thought maybe that the squash might discourage the raccoon to get to his corn. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that, just because the Three Sisters story has become such a mainstream story, but it is part of a larger creation story, and it is not around to appropriate being part of the dominant culture. At the same time, of course, if my landlord wants to grow squash and beans and corn, he's free to do so, because these plants do not belong to anyone. It just led me to have this interesting conversation about spiritual traditions and making it their own without acknowledging the more complex background and the oppressions that are embedded in our interactions with these spiritual traditions, and how problematic it can be. As the Three Sisters story becomes absorbed in our culture, it's another way that Native people's knowledge, wisdom, and traditions get assimilated. And anyways, it was just like a short note and that I wanted to bring to the conversation. I think these are conversations that we should have within our seed companies when we steward Indigenous seeds. And I just wanted to finish the story by saying that the flesh of this squash was donated to a nonprofit, and they're gonna turn it into delicious soup, and the soup will be shared with people in need in our community. So yeah, it's just a short story of the Canada Crookneck squash, summer 2020, Monceau, Quebec. Yeah, thank you.
And I might just follow that by saying there's some strains of things, and everyone has their expressions about this, but this was not a strain that is for sale. So there's seed that involves money, or I should say sale, and there's seed that involves maybe compensation and respect. So the compensation that Marie-Claude is getting is her efforts and respect for her as a seed grower. This seed will not be being sold in a seed company. So there is a different frame for some seed. This Canadian Crookneck strain, I hope, and it's only up to each person that eventually handles it, because you cannot determine whose hands it will be in once it moves. But at this moment, I hope that this strain continues to be not a, quote, commercial strain. And with that, thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much. Jodi, you're up next. I'm going to invite you to share your screen and your slides. And while we get that going, I just want to, send an appreciation to all three of you so far who've been speaking. There's a big conversation right now about cultural appropriation and what that means. And that conversation has a really meaningful place in considerations about what good seed is. And it's so informative to hear you guys talk about it so thoughtfully here. So thank you very much for that. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so we're going to just move it right along when Jodi is ready.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to build on what Heron has talked about. Quickly, my background is that I was a vegetable seed breeder with high mowing seeds for about close to 15 years. I worked on developing squash, both summer and winter squash, peppers, tomatoes. As Petra mentioned, all these wet seed crops are by far the easiest to work with in our climate. And so we have the ability to really make change to adapt to our region really well. Out of that work, I really grew an appreciation for where you need to grow the different stages of your crops, because when you're developing your crop, as Heron was talking about, you start with something we call foundation seed. All right. And this is basically what you take straight from your breeding plot. Now, it's really important that you're doing this in the region where you want the seed to be adapted. So you want to do your breeding in the region that you're going to want your crop to perform. And in the Northeast, you know, it helps us when we put, in some cases, put our breeding plots in the most challenging spots, because if it's going to do well in someplace like northern Vermont, which has a very short season, even shorter than Maine, if it's going to do well here, it's going to do well in most parts of New England, at least. And so when we take our packets of seed, so we make our intense selections within a breeding plot, and breeding plots are small. They're very, very intensive. You put in something in the order of hundreds of plants. You select something like 5 or fewer. So you're taking the fruit from 5 or fewer plants, and now you're talking about packets of seed. So these are really small quantities, and this is what we call foundation seed. And you expect this to be high quality, but not completely uniform yet, because you're taking it straight from your breeding plot, and you aren't optimizing for seed production in that plot. You're optimizing for selection. So from those packets of seed that you take out of your breeding plot, you go next to this intermediate stage that we call stock seed. Now, this, in my mind, goes from packets to pounds, a few pounds. So this is not giant sacks of seed. This is the 1 to 5 pound seeds. This is where you're really doing your cleanup on your what you brought out of your breeding plot. When you're only working on a small plot in a breeding project, you don't get a sense of the true variation in your genetics because you just don't have enough plants to see it. So when you go from a few hundred plants to a few thousand plants, now you can really see everything that your genetic stock contains within it. And you want it to be, we want it to have some variability. We don't want it to be 100% uniform, as Heron was talking about. 100% uniform is dangerous. It has no more room to adapt. So we're looking to develop a variety, and I always preferred to work in open pollinated crops when I could, because they have more innate adaptation still to come. They're harder to breed. They're easier in some ways, harder in others. It's hard to breed a really high quality open pollinated crop because it's a whole population that's intercrossing. So when you go to your stock seed of a few thousand plants, now you're getting a range. And your job when you're doing a stock seed selection is to narrow that range to what you consider a suitable range for something you're going to call by one name. This is this variety. It's not going to be 100% identical, but as we remember from Heron's slide with all those long necks and rounds, it can't be that variable either, because you're going to distribute this to farmers who are harvesting, and they have a narrow range that they have to meet to please their customers or their distributors, and they're okay with a little variation, but they're not okay with too much variation. And so some of the art, where this goes from a science to an art, is developing that range and what is an acceptable range, and enhancing that variability without overdoing it. So there's art in there, and you can see in a field like this with all these flags, this can take more than 1 year for your first stock seed. It can take 2. Sometimes there's a real off type, and I'm going to talk in a little bit in a moment about inbreeding crops versus outbreeding crops. All the squashes are outbreeding crops. So if you have one off type in your field of 1,000 plants and you don't catch it before everything sets fruit, you pretty much have to self a few and try again, because you're not going to clean that up. So from stock seed, when you do have a few pounds of really good, clean seed that you feel good about, now you go into production. This is from a few pounds to 100 pounds, or a few hundred pounds. It can be a few thousand pounds. It's not as important to do this production in the region where you're going to sell this seed or expect it to be produced, because you're not doing selection other than very minimal selection on your production seed. You did your intensive selection on your stock seed. When you're producing your seed for sale, the most important thing when we talk about good seed is those things that came up in Stephanie's cloud picture, word cloud, the high quality germination, disease-free. Oftentimes, New England is not the place to get that highest quality seed. And sometimes we can do a production at the same cost in another region and get really high quality seed. And we would not use that to grow our next production seed because it wasn't under selection, but we can have a really good quality seed to use for commercial seed. If there's any questions, anybody feel free to pop up a chat and I'm happy to stop. I'm going to move on to a different topic of inbreeding versus outcrossing as it relates to growing seed in northern North America. Because as we've mentioned, we really do best, because we're so wet of a climate, we do best with the wet seeded crops. And by wet seeded, of course, we mean the ones that have a wet fruit. Something like a brassica or that has a pod, that is a fruit technically, but it's not a wet fruit. That's a dry fruit. So those dry fruited seeds can be easy to grow here, but there's a whole bunch of them, and some are easy, some are hard, some need more heat. They go all over the place. Pretty much all the wet seeded crops do well here. They all are pretty adapted to our region. Among these, there are inbreeding, there's our two best inbreeding crops are peppers and tomatoes. There are also 3 inbreeding dry seeded crops that do pretty well in our region. And as Petra mentioned, one of those is lettuce. Beans and peas can also do well. Beans require a fair amount of heat to finish, what we call finish our seed at the end of the season. Peas are pretty forgiving. Both beans and peas have a fair number of diseases that attack them. So if we have a very wet climate, we can really struggle with keeping the mold off these seeds. And same with lettuce. It's mold that just lives in our humid air that often attacks these crops and makes them challenging. Whereas the wet seeded crops all have a fruit that protects them from the mold in the air. So when you get your seed out of those fruits, it's very clean because it wasn't exposed to the air. Among the outcrossing, all the squashes and then all the crucifers are outcrossing crops. Like we said, the crucifers with pods can work here, but the ones that work best are not the biennials, but the annuals. The biennials can be really challenging. The annuals are things like the mustards, the mizunas, the Asian greens. Those are all annual crops with pods, and they can do really, really well here. They can be adapted to your farm. Again, they struggle a little bit with mold in the air, whereas all the squashes are really reliable. The squashes are, so if you're getting started with seed, my point of all of this is you might want to start with the easiest, which is the inbreeding wet seeded, the peppers and tomatoes. Your next easiest is probably your squashes, which are outcrossing wet crops. And then when you get a little more skilled, you might want to tackle some of the dry seeded crops. And you probably might want to start with the inbreeding ones and then move to the outbreeding ones. But you can improve your genetics on your farm really very easily. And I would recommend thinking about doing this as just part of your annual daily process. Because every time you grow a crop of tomatoes, you can improve, you can select and improve with almost no extra work. It's so easy to do. So every time you go to a crop of tomatoes, this one's in a house, but it doesn't have to be. If you just walk those rows and pick the plants that please you because they have the most fruit, they look the most clean, the fruit's the most uniform, and you just flag those best plants. You know, say you're going to walk 200 plants and flag 5, your 5 best. All you do then is harvest that fruit separately, and that is stock seed essentially. And you can use that to plant your next crop. You've improved the genetics for your location just by picking your 5 best plants. They don't cross with anything else. They may cross slightly with the, you know, tomatoes can cross at a very low rate. I think it's 2%. The tomatoes that are a little less heavily bred, the ones that have potato leaves, they'll cross a little more. The ones that have not potato leaves, more cut leaves, those are have a more closed up flower, and those cross less. But any one of these will only cross at a small percent. And by flagging your best plants, and this is the same for peppers as it is for tomatoes, when you harvest that seed, you have improved genetics for your own field, and it's just so easy to do. What do I have? Okay. So, and there's really not much to saving the seed either of these. For tomatoes, they have this gel around the outside that does best when it's fermented off by just keeping it in warm water for 2 days. There's not much to that. You keep it in warm water until the gel has dispersed, not much more than 2 days because it will start to sprout. But then you wash the seed on a screen, and you can even rub off the last of the gel. You can dry it on a paper towel, and there you have some stock seed. It's just very easy. And peppers are even easier because they don't have a gel. So take your peppers out of your fruit, dry them on a paper towel, save that seed in a packet. I encourage you to try it if you haven't. But the important part of it is doing your selection throughout your season. The harvesting is easy. If you develop an eye for always just keeping an eye out for your best plants, and in an inbreeding crop, all you have to do is flag the plant. You don't have to harvest every last fruit from that plant. You can just harvest a couple, and you'll have enough seed to grow another crop potentially. You just keep it separate, and you label it separate, and that's it. They reward you almost immediately. And if you do that every year, you know, you can take it in a new direction. You can decide, I want to change the color of this crop, and you happen to get one yellow or one orange in a red crop. Take that yellow or orange plant, grow that seed again, and you know, you could get a mix, or you could happen to get lucky and get one that's breeding true for that color. So try it. Okay, I'm going to talk about outcrossing plants quickly. Oh, I forgot to set my timer. Sorry, Steph. You'll tell me, but I talk fast. So when you're dealing with outcrossing plants, particularly squash, and the reason we do so much work with squash is there's just so many different squashes, and they all do well here. This includes the cucurbits and the melons, but even within the cucurbita genus, this includes at least 3 species that we can grow here. We talked about butternut, which is a Cucurbita machata. We can also grow the Cucurbita maximas, which is all the buttercups and the kabochas, all the Hubbards. And then the Cucurbita pepo is the biggest group, and includes most of the summer squashes. It includes the delicata squash, the acorn squash, all the pumpkins. These are just big groups. And because they're outcrossing, if you're not going to do good planning, you're going to just have things that cross in unexpected ways. So if you want to work in these crops, you need to plan to manage the pollen. And so I'm just giving a real basics here for people who haven't tried this before. You can quickly see a fruit that these blue arrows are pointing at a female on the left and a male on the right. These are ones that haven't opened yet. Next to them are ones that have opened, and you would expect those have already crossed. So you would not harvest those. So if you're going to want to save seed from an outcrossing plant, you have to identify the fruit that before they open. Then you, so this is a male that's going to open the next day, and this is a female that's going to open the next day. And you can tell this when they start to have some color in the petals.
Brand new.
Say that? Oh. And this is the stage at which you would close them, so bees can't visit. They're going to open the next day and be receptive. Oh, I went the wrong way. You would close these fruits. This is somebody doing it with twist ties. We generally just buy big boxes of twist ties and do this. These are closed when they look like this. They're closed, and the next morning they'll look like this. So this is PM on day 1. When you select the ones you want to cross the next day. On day 2, you're going to make your cross, and the flowers will have ballooned open because they're now receptive. And at that point, you're going to use your male, this is your male flower. Inside it will have a stamen, and you're going to use that like a paintbrush. You take off the petals, you paint the pollen onto the female stigma, and then you close it back up again. And I didn't have a great picture of this. Is one picture. You can do it with tape. You can also do it with the same twist ties again. But you close it back up because you don't want the bees to visit. And once you have done that, and you flag, so if you, I'm going back to this one because once you've done that, you flag it with flagging. Now you have a fruit that has only the pollen that you want it to have. And you can harvest the seed from this fruit, and it will be clean seed. It will be the fruit, it will have the genetics only of that plant or a closely related plant that you selected. Okay, you're going to harvest the seed only from your flagged fruits. This is just a picture I had of something we were working on. You can, there's these squashes have so much room and flexibility. They're so much fun to work with. And you are harvesting the seed only from those fruit. So you are making your own choices, and it just requires that you do that planning while the fruit are setting their seed in July. So again, improving your genetics is about paying attention to the genetics from as soon as you planted them until you harvest the seed. And that's all I had.
That's amazing, Jodi. Thank you so much. The topic of stock seed in particular, and sometimes foundation seed and production seed, comes up quite a bit in our training surveys as something that people want more information about, and you laid it out so clearly. I took a page and a half of notes, and, and I'm not even a seed grower. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share that with whoever. Share it away.
Wonderful. Yeah, it was really well laid out. Also, for those of you who joined yesterday, it's an interesting connection because I think Heron and some of our regional growers talked a little bit about doing seed, saving seed at that kind of stock seed scale, and how well suited it is to the kind of regional or craft production that lots of people here are engaged in. So I think that's really useful for people. So we're going to move on to our final presentation from Marie-Claude. Marie-Claude, can you see your slides on the screen now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great.
All right. So good morning, everybody. So in this little presentation, I want to tell you what good seed is to me. So I'm a regional contract grower. And I will first tell you a little bit about my farm operation, Radicule Farm. And then I want to elaborate a little bit on the 5 keywords that to me represent what a good seed is. So these 5 words are adaptive, healthy, shared, stewarded, and sacred. So as Stephanie mentioned, my name is Marie-Claude and I own Radicule Farm in Quebec. I grow organic seeds on contract for regional seed companies. This is my 6th year growing seeds commercially. I previously worked with Dan Brisebois at Tournesol Farm, where I learned the art of seed saving. You can switch slide, Steph. And that's it. So my farm has been in operation since 2018. So this is my second season growing seeds on contract. I am still a humble beginner, and I often have more questions than answers. So it's interesting that I have the mic right now. Thank you to the other panelists as well. I definitely consider you as my mentors, and hopefully I can bring something new to the conversation, as there aren't many contract growers that work on my size of scale that I know of. So I farm on 1.5 acres, and at this point it's starting to feel pretty tight. My goal is to reach 6 acres by 2022, including cover crops, of course, but I'm really hoping that it will give me more room to breathe, and also more room for better crop rotation, and as a result, better pest and disease management. Most of my field operations are done using horsepower. So I have a Belgian mare named Queen, and she has more seasons experience than I do. She's 17 years old and has done farm work all her life. And so she has definitely walked more furrows than I have. She's an integral part of this farm adventure. And yeah, seeds are, I have 3 fields in total for isolation distance purposes. And yeah, I'm certified organic, as I already mentioned. You can switch slides, Steph. If I talk too fast, you can tell me. Sometimes I can't really hear myself talk.
You're doing great. It's a really
thank you. All right, so I grow seeds with, so I have 8 buyers at the moment. Some are in Ontario, some in Quebec, and some on the American side of the border, always in the Northeast. So keeping it regional, whatever that means. The contracts I have averaged $350 for each contract. I grow 70 varieties each year, so I specialize in a little bit of everything. And yeah, just to give you an idea of the scale, this year I grew 300 kilos of peas and beans, 30 kilos of cucurbit seeds, and 4 kilos of tomato and pepper seed. So of course, for that amount of seeds, I need more specialized equipment. So I use a millet wet vegetable seed extractor and a small stationary combine for extracting the seed. You can switch slides. Thank you. So what is good seed? Oh, this is my stationary combine, by the way, on the left. You can switch slides. Thank you. So good seed adapts. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this project I have, and that got started this summer with Ferme Croque Saison. So they are market growers, and we are working to improve the Jaune rutabaga, which is a regional favorite. We are selecting traits like disease resistance and root shape and size. It's a project that came from a need that regional market farmers expressed. And so 100 roots got selected this summer. They will get replanted next year. And hopefully, in the meantime, I will be able to find someone to buy and distribute the seeds that will be produced. I think one interesting thing that contract growers, or as not necessarily contract growers, but seed growers in general, can do is collaborate with market farmers, especially for biennials and selecting rootstock. It really allows us, and collaborating with this farm especially, it allows me to have access to a a wide population from which to choose a couple plants with the most desirable traits. And as a seed grower or a contract grower, I could never justify growing so many rutabagas, you know, thousands of rutabagas, unless I got pigs, of course. But still, I don't want to get into, you know, wholesaling rutabaga. So teaming up with farmers, I think for biennials is really precious. Next slide. Good seed is healthy, so it germinates, it is disease-free, it is vigorous, it is pure. What a perfect world. As a contract grower, of course, quality is crucial. So beyond, you know, germ rate and vigor, I would say that I'm personally more concerned with seed-borne pathogens. I feel like it's not something that is talked about much in our scale of production, in my opinion. But to put you into context, you know, as a contract grower, and here I'm assuming everybody knows what a contract grower is, but if you want more details about that, you can ask in the Q&A at the end. But as a contract grower, you know, I get seeds from this year 8 different seed companies. So that means that if, for example, I get a cucurbit seed that is contaminated with a bacteria, well, it is very likely that it will spread to all the cucurbits in that patch. And the seeds from that patch will get sent to 4 or 5 different seed companies. So to use a COVID analogy, I'm sorry, I feel that my farm is kind of like an airport. And yes, you know, the seeds I grow are regional, but these seeds do not necessarily stay in my bioregion. Seeds travel. And so I guess I just want to encourage everybody to be aware of what you send out, you know, in terms of quality of, you know, when you grow the crop, you know, keep your eyes open for diseases. I do take practical steps to make sure that I do my best not to send out contaminated seed stock. If the seed stock is contaminated, or if I suspect that it is, when I look at the state of the crop, you know, I really want to be able to tell the buyer what the pathogen is and what can be done about it. So I work closely with an agronomist, and as soon as I notice something wrong in the crop, I send a sample to a lab for testing. The costs I find can be pretty prohibitive, so it ranges from $50 to $150 per sample. In Quebec, we're lucky enough that we get 5 free lab tests a year if we are certified organic. So I make sure that I use these 5 free lab tests every year. And of course, you know, diseases happen and it's something that's out of our control, but and it's a conversation I'm having right now with one of the buyers about compensation in such a case. Do I need to mention that agriculture is a risky business? Other practical steps that I can use to make sure that the seeds are disease-free is, you know, carrying a spray bottle with a 10% bleach solution to disinfect pruning shears and my boots when I go from one field to another. So I make sure I carry that spray bottle in the car, in the truck, I should say. And at the end of the season, I use this same bleach solution to disinfect, you know, greenhouse trays, tarps, and landscape fabric that the crop is grown on. It's not the most fun process, but I feel like it just gives me reassurance. Just a quick reference, I think next slide, Steph. Oh, maybe the PowerPoint hasn't been updated, but I had put a reference to, I can just maybe add it to the chat box. It's, so I find that when we question ourselves about diseases and their severity and are they seed-borne or not, I just found that on the Organic Seed Alliance website, you can find they're like the quick reference guides for growing carrots, for example. And in this reference guide, there's a section that will list the most important diseases of this crop. And it will tell you if it's seed-borne. It will also tell you if it's bad, if it's really bad, or if it's really, really bad. And I think it can like allow us to just give us a better idea of what the severity of this disease is. Also, starting next year, I will start hot water treating all the seeds that can be hot water treated, just to make sure to eliminate any pathogen that might have gotten in the seeds via the vascular tissue. And okay, I'm really quite passionate about diseases, but I'm gonna stop now, and I think maybe somebody else will talk about it in more details in the afternoon webinar. Next, oh no, this is the right slide. Okay, let's talk about crossing. Oh, it seems like somebody has put up a link about plant diseases. Thank you. I will make sure to check it out. So good seed is shared. Well, good seed is shared is a fancy way for me to say that that the seed I grow for American seed companies will find their way across the border. I don't know if I put the link, Steph, if you go to the next slide. Oh, I haven't. Okay, so you can back up a little bit. All right. So I had put a link to the Plants for Planting manual from the USDA, and it's a 1,300 pages long document. But it really covers all of the special requirements and exceptions, and I can also put the link in the chat box. So in order to export seeds to the United States, if it's considered a big seed lot, you will require a FIDO certificate. If it's a small seed lot, you won't. I can also talk about FIDO certificates in more details this afternoon if people feel like it would be relevant. But basically, you just send a request to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. You give them the name of the seeds, their weight, and the importer. And they will just come over to your place, proceed to a visual inspection, and issue the certificate. Hopefully, no problem. However, as Adrian mentioned yesterday, there is a big problem right now called the tomato brown rugose fruit virus or something like that that occurs in peppers and tomatoes, and it is it is becoming a problem to export seeds to the United States. You will need an additional lab test done, and also I can talk more about it this afternoon if need be. Next slide. Good seed is stewarded, and it comes from well-cared for stock seed. So I just wanted to show you this example of the French breakfast radish. This is the 2019 root selection, not so bad. And then this year, the 2020 picture at the bottom on the right is the seed. So these are the radishes I got from the seed that got sent to me this year, and I'm like, how could it go from, you know, this to this? Yeah. And you know, I look at these roots and I'm like, do I really even want to plant them? Like, it's not gonna give me anything good. Like, I just know. But what happened is that the seed I I had sent out in 2019 didn't get sent back to me. It was just another, you know, generic seed lot from a, I guess, a bigger seed company that got sent to me. But, you know, you can really tell which line had a little bit more love. And yeah, it just was just a little bit disappointing. And we can move to the next slide. This is my horse. Of course, I had to put a picture. And yeah, the last thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit less scientific, but still very important. I just wanted to say that good seed is sacred, and in fact, all seed is sacred. It's a little bit funny of me, I find, to be saying that, because I parted ways with my Catholic background a while ago now, but getting into farming and seed saving really allowed me to, you know, experience and feel that there is more and really reconnect with my spiritual life. I really became hungry for more connection. And, you know, in our society, I feel like the only options I have is secularism, or this mainstream, very rigid image of God. And it just made me feel like I had no way to calm this hunger for connection. And, you know, I became kind of fascinated with the Native people's beautiful creation story, which is not mine to tell. And somehow I had forgotten that in my own Judeo-Christian tradition, the creation story is also, you know, joyful and creative, and it flows, it's cyclical, and it's alive. But I did have to do some work to deconstruct the mainstream view of that myth. And so religion or spiritual practices as cultural and wisdom traditions and as human constructs are responses to experiences of the sacred. And in that way, I think that seeds themselves are a kind of sacrament, if that makes sense. And, you know, planting a seed really becomes a real and tangible act of faith. And of course, when the field is sown and you contemplate it after sowing, it's a little bit like a prayer of hope. So yeah, I think I'm going to finish on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful, well-paced and wide-ranging presentation, Marie-Claude. It's so wonderful to hear about your experience with everything from, rutabaga trialing to cross-border shipping to kind of your beautiful ending note. So you have some nice appreciation in the chat box there. I'm not seeing a lot of questions in chat. I'm wondering if any of our presenters would like to offer up any closing comments or anything before we adjourn, I guess.
I would like to just offer my appreciation to my other presenters and say my most gratefulness to Jodi Lew-Smith for joining us today. She's been a bit away from seed for a bit, but is still in our hearts a seed mentor. And thank you so much, Jodi. And also it is Petra's birthday today. So we would like to offer happy 37 as a crowd to Petra.
Happy birthday, Petra.
Happy birthday, Petra.
So honored that you chose to share it with us.
It's so lovely to be here with you all. Thank you. Many happy returns of all of our days.
Good to be back in the seed world. It was a kindness to invite me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you each of you for coming and sharing so thoughtfully with us. We have one more webinar this afternoon. We'll be picking up on some of those themes of, healthy seed, germinating seed, pure seed, diseased seed. We're going to be talking about all of those things in relation to seed quality assurance this afternoon. So hopefully some of you are registered for that, and I will see you then.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Hold on.
Oh,
we have one question.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yep. Marie-Claude, there's a question. What was the biggest challenge for you starting out as a contract seed grower?
Oh, biggest challenge. Oh, let me am I muted?
No, you are not muted. You
Oh,
are frozen. You're
all
fine.
right. Okay. My biggest challenge. I would say that I had trouble with my first landlord, just because it wasn't super clear what the expectations were at first. So in February, just before starting my seedlings, he decided that he would rather not have me start my farm on his property. So it was a really probably most stressful moment of my life, you know, already having contracts and being ready to start my seedlings basically, and realizing that I wouldn't have anywhere to grow these seeds. So I really went into plan A, B, C, D, E mode, and finally bought some land, and that is being transitioned right now. So I'm still renting on another property, but yeah, definitely I would say like make sure that you have a clear understanding, like that both parties are on the same page is really important. Another challenge, I think, well, I'm a one-person operation, so that can be challenging sometimes, definitely. Just getting motivated sometimes when I work alone, you know, most of the week and all day long. When it's just me and myself, sometimes, yeah, it's a little, it's a little overwhelming. So I always, you know, but I say that, and I have a great community, and I have a bunch of volunteers that come over, and my mom comes out and help once a week. So yeah, I work alone, but I'm still very well surrounded. So it's it would be something I would advise. Get yourself, you know, surround yourself with good people, and people who will, you know, really take to heart to help you, and that will really be passionate by your project and willing to, you know, go the extra mile, I think, to offer you help without expecting anything in return, because, you know, when you're starting, you don't have much to give back. But after 2 years now, I feel I can really you know, give back to these people that have been of such precious help. And yeah, so I think that answers the question.
I'm wondering if anybody else wants to chime in on that question from the perspective of a company that is collaborating with growers at that scale. Thank you. Any other comments on that question from, I think it was Mike?
Well, if I can add something, I think
Sure.
when the interaction between the contract grower and the seed company, of course, communication is key, but I find that the biggest challenge really is the timing. Oftentimes, I do not know what I'm going to grow until mid-March. And even this year, you know, everybody was so flooded with the COVID challenges that I did not have a clear idea until, you know, I received my pepper seeds and I was like, oh yeah, they were supposed to, you know, be seeded last week. So it's really hard for me to plan for a good crop rotation if I don't even know the quantities or which crops I'm going to grow. So I think the earlier we can have the conversations, the better.
Okay, great. Well, I'll say thank you once again to all of our panelists, Heron, Marie-Claude, Petra, and Jodi. Petra, have a wonderful birthday. I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and we'll see many of you back here for the afternoon session, I hope. So thanks everybody and take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Stephanie. Bye, everybody.